In the year 1842, when the wind still dragged its knuckles across the fields of Dogwood Parish, 3 sisters lived at the edge of a salt-blind ridge, where no roads ran, and no map dared to draw. Their house was tall, narrow, and leaning always to the left, as though eavesdropping on the earth. Locals called it the Carroway House, though no one remembered why. The sisters, Eunice, Hester, and Meribeth, were never seen apart, always cloaked in mourning black, always carrying baskets of herbs or tallow-soaked rags. And when a child was due, or a mother bled too long, it was not the town doctor that came riding, but one of them, barefoot and wordless, walking the full distance with a linen bag slung over her shoulder. The Carroways never knocked, they simply arrived, and once inside, they never left until it was over. Some said they whispered prayers in tongues older than the hills, others said they never spoke at all. Before we go any further, tell us, where are you watching from, and what time is it there right now? Drop it in the comments below. The first record of their presence came not from any census or church roll, but from a burial ledger kept in a rusted tin at the base of a whitewashed cross. It listed only first names and causes: Eliza, ruptured womb; Charity, breech birth; Ruth, bled dry. Each entry followed by 3 initials, E, each C, MC, all the time. The pattern was hard to ignore. Where the Carroways went, death often followed, not the violent kind, but the slow, solemn withering reserved for those who lingered too long between here and not. Still, families begged for their help, because no matter the cost, the babies came back breathing, or most of them did. One winter, a farmer named Jonah Bray claimed his son hadn't cried once since the birth, said the boy just stared, night and day, with eyes that never blinked, and a mouth that never moved. When he tried to take the child to the church for christening, he found the font dry, and the altar covered in dead flies. By the spring of 1843, whispers grew roots. At the edge of the market square, beneath the shadow of the town's old stone well, mothers began to trade stories in hushed voices, hands trembling beneath shawls. One claimed her baby wouldn't sleep unless cradled in salt. Another said her daughter wept blood at dusk until the Carroways returned and placed a dried reed beneath her pillow. The preacher's wife, who had lost 2 sons to fever, swore she saw Hester Carroway in her garden at dawn, burying something beneath the elder tree, a lump wrapped in hair and twine. When confronted, Hester only smiled and said, "It will keep the spirits from gnawing." No one knew if she meant the dead or the living. After that, no one spoke to the preacher's wife again. She left town within the week, muttering that her new baby had no shadow and would not speak the Lord's name. The church bell stopped ringing that summer, not from rust or weather, but because the rope had been sliced clean through. No one admitted to seeing it done, but many suspected the Carroways. They were never seen at services, never knelt, never crossed themselves, never recited verse. And yet, when illness swept through the township, when the ash fever took 12 in 1 week, it was Eunice Carroway who appeared first at every door, placing bowls of boiled bark beneath cribs, murmuring to the sick, as if speaking to something only she could hear. The afflicted who survived described the same thing, the sound of distant hooves echoing through their fevers, and a cool hand pressing their chest, holding something inside them down. The doctor called it mass delirium. The priest called it blasphemy, but the Carroways called it necessary. The veil weakens when the body burns. Eunice was once heard to say, and some things must not slip through. One night in early August, a boy named Levi Donnell wandered too close to the Carroway house. He'd been dared by his older brother to knock on their door, just once, and run. But Levi never made it that far. He returned hours later, barefoot and silent, his shirt soaked through, and one eye turned inward. He wouldn't speak, not even when his mother shook him, not even when the town doctor waved smoke beneath his nose. Only when the preacher pressed a palm to the boy's head did Levi whisper something, one word, wailing. The next morning, his hair had turned fully white. His family moved out of town within days. When neighbors checked the hill for tracks, they found nothing but a series of small handprints pressed into the dirt outside the Carroway gate, far too small to belong to any of the sisters, but deep, as if whatever made them had sunk into the earth and waited. That autumn, the leaves refused to fall, trees held tight to brittle brown canopies, while the air thickened with something not quite rot, not quite smoke. Livestock miscarried in pairs, crows lingered longer than they should, and beneath it all the Carroways continued their work. A stillbirth in the south orchard, a breach near the river bend. Each time they arrived before being summoned, some began to believe they could feel when a birth was near, like dogs before a storm, like wolves tracking blood beneath snow. A girl named Elise, who had lost her voice after a lightning strike, delivered twins under their care. She claimed the sisters never touched her once, said they sat in silence around her bed, and hummed in three-part harmony, until the room grew too bright to see. The children were born with eyes open. One of them never cried, the other would not stop smiling for 6 weeks. The town council met in secret. After the frost set in, 4 men and 2 widows gathered beneath the chapel's floorboards, each holding a list of names, those who had suffered strange births, those who had fallen ill, those who had seen things they could not explain. Every list ended with one surname, Carroway. The preacher, who had once defended them, now refused to speak aloud when their house was mentioned. God turns his face, he muttered, eyes fixed on a knot in the wood. The council agreed on a visit, 1 man per sister, under the guise of gratitude, but only 2 returned. The third, a tanner named Joel Minton, was last seen entering the Carroway gate at dusk, carrying a satchel of elderflower and a peace offering in the form of lamb's wool. The satchel was later found beside the creek, unopened. His boots sat upright on the porch step, dry despite the rain. By the end of that year, births dropped to nearly none. Fields lay fallow, not from drought, but from dread. Couples kept their distance in their own homes. Mothers whispered warnings to daughters, and no one dared look too long at a child whose features shifted subtly with the seasons. The Carroway house grew quieter, its chimney smoke less frequent, though no one believed they had left. Some said they slept underground, beneath beds lined with feathers, plucked from black swans. Others believed they were waiting for a name that would unlock something old and unfinished. One night, a stranger arrived on horseback, trailing dust from 3 counties over. He bore a wax-sealed letter and a cross carved from burnt yew. When he reached the crest of the Carroway hill, his horse refused to step forward. The man dismounted, walked the rest of the way alone. The sun rose red the next morning. Neither man nor cross were ever seen again. In early 1844, a drought crept in from the south, dry enough to crack bark and bleach bones in the fields. Wells emptied without warning. Frogs vanished. Rain stopped naming itself. But on the ridge above Dogwood Parish, the Carroway garden bloomed, lush, overgrown, humming with insects no one could name. Pale roots burst through fence posts. Blossoms the color of bruises clung to twisted stems, and fruit dripped to syrup that stained stone. When a schoolboy wandered too close, drawn by the scent of something sweet and rotting, he returned with both palms blistered, and a shard of tooth lodged in his ankle. He claimed the vines moved on their own. They breathed, he whispered. They knew I was there. The doctor dismissed it as sun fever. But the boy's mother left town within the week, after waking to find her front door nailed shut from the outside, and her curtains twisted into knots that spelled her son's name. That same season, a midwife from neighbouring Clark Hollow came unannounced into town, asking after the Carroways by name. Her arrival stirred unease. No one had spoken the sisters' names aloud in months, not since the ridge turned silent. She wore a yellow bonnet and carried a copper basin tied with hemp cord, insisting she'd been summoned by letter to assist with a difficult birth. No such letter was found. No one admitted to sending it. The midwife pressed on anyway, walking the ridge path, as though drawn by something older than invitation. 2 days passed. On the 3rd morning, The preacher's hound was found at the chapel steps, foaming and limping, its fur mottled with red welts shaped like fingers. The copper basin was discovered in the creek bed, warped and darkened, as if burned from within. The midwife herself never returned, but neighbors claimed they heard singing from the ridge that night. 3 voices joined by a 4th, thinner, higher, and not quite human. It was Marybeth Carroway who began appearing alone. Always the youngest, always the one who walked a step behind. She came into town under cover of fog one morning, her apron stained with something between rust and wine, her eyes unfocused and bare of lashes. She stopped outside the post office and stared at the flagpole until the sun fully rose. When the shopkeeper tried to greet her, she murmured only a single word, "Measure," then turned and left. No one followed. That same day, 3 men discovered a row of carved symbols beneath the floorboards of the schoolhouse, each identical to the last, concentric circles around a crude eye. The teacher insisted she'd never seen them before. The next week, she left without collecting her pay. Her replacement lasted less than a month, claiming the blackboard chalk wrote names of its own accord, names of children not yet born, or never born at all. Marybeth was seen watching from the edge of the trees. Eunice Carroway was next to emerge, walking barefoot into the blacksmith's yard, one fog-heavy morning, long before the first bell of labour. Her hands were wrapped in gauze, but her sleeves were clean, her voice still steady. She asked for nails, not horseshoe nails, not coffin tacks, but a very specific number, 41. When asked why, she replied, "One for every breath he wasn't supposed to take." The blacksmith gave them freely, but didn't sleep that night. His wife later confessed he woke screaming, clawing at his chest, insisting something was hammering inside his ribs. He died 3 days later, with no wound and no known cause. Afterward, the nails were found beneath his pillow, arranged in the shape of a cradle. The local physician called it grief. The reverend called it judgment. But those who remembered the way Eunice held her silence knew better. She had not come for help. She had come to return what was owed. A child was born on the edge of Wethersfield the following week. Though no one saw the labour, the mother, a quiet girl named Maynard Pearl, had vanished from the town rolls months prior, said to have wandered into the woods near the Carroway Ridge after her father's funeral. She returned barefoot and dazed, carrying a swaddled infant with skin too pale and hair too fine to catch the wind. She said she didn't remember the birth, only the sound of breathing that wasn't hers. And when asked the child's name, she answered, "He already has one. They gave it to him." The infant would not cry, nor would it nurse. It only watched. Within a week the Pearl household went quiet. Curtains drawn, chimney still. A neighbour girl who peered through the window swore the baby was no longer in the cradle, but seated upright at the table, staring at the family as they prayed. No one entered the house after that. By month's end it was empty. When Hester Carroway returned, it was not by foot, but by fire. Witnesses from the far side of the parish claimed to see a strange glow at the crown of the ridge, just after midnight, steady, orange, too bright for lantern or hearth. Yet no smoke followed, no ash drifted, only the sound of iron rasping against iron, rhythmic and deliberate, like the drawing of shears across bone. At sunrise, Hester stood in the centre of the town square, barefoot, her skirt hem soaked and stiff. She held a bundle wrapped in funeral linens and set it at the base of the well. "It belongs to the earth now," she said, voice cracking like old parchment. No one dared unwrap it, but flies came fast and thick. The bundle was gone by dusk, and in its place a perfect circle of hairless soil. No grass would grow there afterward. A child who stepped into it days later emerged with his teeth clamped shut and would not open them again, not to eat, not to speak, not to scream. That winter, silence spread faster than snow. Mail stopped arriving. Roads disappeared beneath drifts, though no one remembered a single flake falling. The chapel bell, long since silenced, began to toll once more, though its rope had never been repaired. Each night at the stroke of 3, A single note rang out across Dogwood Parish, low and hollow, like the breath of a dying thing. Livestock birthed malformed litters. Milk turned sour in the pail. And yet, the Carroway sisters were seen more frequently than ever, walking single file through the woods, with jars of bone-coloured wax and cloth bundles stitched with symbols no one could decipher. A travelling reverend who attempted to intervene vanished on the ridge, leaving behind only his boots and a torn page from his journal. Scrawled across it in cramped script were 5 words: "They are not just midwives." The page was later found sealed behind the chapel cross, smeared with a ring of what appeared to be umbilical blood. By winter, the township had begun to empty, not in sudden flight, but in slow erosion. Families quietly packing wagons at dusk, children lifted from their beds before sunrise, curtains left swaying in open windows. No farewells, no markers, just absence. The Carroway house remained untouched, leaning still into its shadowed slope, its windows dark and door half open, as if awaiting someone expected home long ago. A travelling priest passing through stopped at the chapel to offer mass, only to find the altar gone and the crucifix turned backward. He followed a trail of feathers to the ridge and never returned. His horse wandered into town 3 days later, with its mane sheared and its eyes weeping salt. That same night, 3 infants were born across the parish, none of them to known mothers. Each was left swaddled at a doorstep, bearing no mark but a small stitch at the base of the neck, threaded in hair. The townsfolk buried them. The ground refused to hold. In the thaw of early 1845, a new sound began echoing through the ridge at night. Not the cry of coyotes or the creak of trees breaking under frost, but a low humming, deliberate, layered, almost choral. It rose from the Carroway house just after the second bell and ceased precisely before dawn. Those who heard it described feeling as if something were being pulled from them, memories, marrow, breath. One man, overcome with curiosity, approached the ridge with cotton in his ears and a crucifix nailed to his chest. He was found hours later in his barn, naked from the waist down, hands clasped in prayer, his mouth stuffed full of dried lavender. He lived 3 more days, repeating only one sentence to his grieving wife. It was not song, it was stitching. When he died, every candle in town flickered once, then burned with blue flame until the wick vanished in silence. A new family arrived that spring, unaware of the township's unravelling. The Whateleys, traders from the east, took up residence in an abandoned parsonage near the outer fields. Eager to root themselves, they reopened the schoolhouse and invited neighbours for supper. On their second week, their eldest daughter, Miriam, found a parcel wrapped in oilskin beneath her bed. Inside, a braid of white hair tied with milkweed and a note written in crooked cursive: "The first breath must not be wasted." Her mother burned the braid in the stove. That night, the stove burst open. No fire, just smoke, thick and salt-sweet, that spread across the walls in the shape of 3 open hands. The next morning, Miriam was gone. Her boots were placed neatly on the windowsill, laces soaked in honey. When the Whateleys asked around, the townsfolk simply lowered their eyes. No one offered help. No one spoke the sisters' names. Not anymore. The townsfolk turned to old habits. Doors were marked with lamb's blood, Bibles tucked beneath pillows, mirrors covered with sackcloth from dusk till dawn. Children were no longer taught to pray, but to count backward, to bite their tongues during thunder, to spit when the wind changed direction. Even so, the Carroway presence thickened. Footprints appeared in ash that no one walked through. Cradles rocked on their own. A newborn named Tobias was said to sing in his sleep, strange lullabies in a language no elder could name. When his father tried to record the melody on stave paper, his pen cracked, bleeding ink in the shape of a cradle. Tobias was buried 2 weeks later, though not for illness. He had vanished from his crib. In his place was a mound of river clay, still wet, with the impression of a mouth pressed into its centre. The midwife who prepared the burial quit her post that same night. She walked barefoot into the marsh and was never seen again. By midsummer, birds had stopped singing. Not one crow, not one thrush, only silence, heavy and wide. The Carroway Sisters, now seen only in pairs, moved like shadows, through fields, between rows, always with baskets too still to sway. A farm boy named Caleb, tasked with watching the grain, claimed to see Eunice standing waist-deep in the stalks at dusk, arms outstretched. He watched for nearly an hour, as crows landed upon her, one by one, perching along her shoulders, her arms, her head. She never moved. When he blinked, they were gone, and so was she. He returned to the house with his mouth full of black feathers. Couldn't speak a word, couldn't cry, just sat there breathing slow, feathers slipping one by one from between his lips. That same evening, the parish bell fell from its tower without warning. No wind, no quake, just one sudden groan of iron, then silence, and a crater where the bell struck the earth, shaped uncannily like an open hand. As the year waned, the Carroway house stood vacant, or so the town believed. No candlelight flickered, no footprints marked frost, yet a warm scent, like milk left too long in linen, lingered in the wind. Children born that season were quiet, uncannily so, never crying, never fussing, just watching with large, glass dark eyes. Their mothers kept them wrapped tight, refusing to bring them to the chapel. One mother who tried, claimed the baptismal water turned to steam. Another said her child's skin blistered beneath the cross. Stories thickened of twins born under the same moon, but breathing out of sync, of a girl who wept blood only when the ridge faced east, of infants whispering in sleep. The Carroway sisters were last seen together on the edge of the cornfields at dusk, standing still as scarecrows, arms wrapped in swaddling cloth. Behind them, something shifted in the stalks, taller than any man, and breathing not with lungs, but with memory. September brought with it a harvest that no one touched. Corn grew in tight, contorted spirals. Pumpkins burst open before ripening, revealing veins instead of seeds. Even the wheat turned brittle, crackling underfoot, like bone. At the edge of the farthest field, where the soil had never yielded more than stone, a new crop emerged, tall stalks with velvet red tassels that wept a clear, sweet liquid when cut. No one claimed to plant them, yet every morning more appeared. The Carroways were seen walking the rows in silence, trailing long-handled shears that never rusted. A young woman named Bethany Lawn, curious and unafraid, stole one of the stalks under moonlight and brewed a tea from its leaves. Her mother found her 3 days later in the orchard, seated upright in her wedding gown, hair perfectly plaited and hands clasped around a bundle of moss. Her eyes had been stitched shut, her mouth smiled wide, and every tooth bore a name scratched into the enamel. None of them were hers. October's fog did not lift. It settled low across the parish, thick enough to swallow footsteps, and muffle the sound of hammers and hymnals. Time began to lose its grip. Clocks ran backward, roosters crowed at dusk, and graves grew cold even in daylight. When Marybeth Carroway was seen walking the riverbank barefoot, pressing her palm to the water again and again, no one dared call to her. Children reported hearing lullabies coming from wells and drains. One girl vanished for half a day and returned dry, but with fingernails softened as if she had been underwater for years. She no longer recognized her own name, answering only to the small one, and insisted her birth had not yet occurred. At the town's edge, a midwife's ledger appeared overnight, nailed to the door of the chapel. Its final entry bore no date or mother's name, only a location scrawled in soot beneath the ribs. That evening, the chapel windows bled sap, and the pews were found turned to face the walls. As the year waned, the Carroway house stood vacant, or so the town believed. No candlelight flickered, no footprints marked frost, yet a warm scent, like milk left too long in linen, lingered in the wind. Children born that season were quiet, uncannily so, never crying, never fussing, just watching with large, glass dark eyes. Their mothers kept them wrapped tight, refusing to bring them to the chapel. One mother who tried claimed the baptismal water turned to steam. Another said her child's skin blistered beneath the cross. Stories thickened of twins born under the same moon, but breathing out of sync, of a girl who wept blood only when the ridge faced east, of infants whispering in sleep. The Carroway sisters were last seen together on the edge of the cornfields at dusk, standing still as scarecrows, arms wrapped in swaddling cloth. Behind them, something shifted in the stalks, taller than any man, and breathing not with lungs, but with memory. By the turn of 1846, Dogwood Parish no longer appeared on circuit maps. Riders passed it by without pause, marking only a blank stretch of ridge, where once there'd been plotted lines, parcel names, and chapels with recorded pew counts. Surveyors sent from Augusta reported soft ground unsuitable for homestead, though none could explain the outline of fence posts, or the narrow trails pressed into the brush, still warm from passage. What few families remained there did so quietly, as if not to startle something. Gardens were not planted that year. Church services ceased without official word, yet smoke still curled from the chimney of the Carroway house, crooked and calm, rising through fog that refused to lift. 3 windows blinked with light in no rhythm known to man. First one, then 2, then none for days. Those who stayed whispered of wooden bowls appearing overnight, placed at their doors, beneath eaves, on fence posts, always filled with a slick black liquid that smelled faintly of breast milk and rust. The bowls were never seen being delivered, but they came without fail. Some families poured them out without question, and nothing happened. Others kept them unsure why, allowing the liquid to congeal or steam depending on the room. But one man, Jacob Fincher, a carpenter with no wife and no kin, tossed his untouched bowl into the hearth on a dare from himself. The fire hissed and shuddered, but did not take. That night, he heard footsteps on his roof, slow, deliberate, heavier than any animal, but with a cadence that suggested something expectant, like a woman late in her 9th month. He did not sleep. By morning his roof was ruined. Every shingle had been turned inward, folded like paper, and each nail bent skyward as though pulled from within. In the center of his parlor sat a cradle made of ashwood and hair. Inside it, nothing, except a single molar, pink at the root. Fincher fled by nightfall, his wagon packed with every tool he owned. He was never seen again, but the cradle remained for weeks, unmoved, until a field mouse was found dead inside it. Not chewed, not crushed, simply hollow, skin intact but deflated, as if its breath had been stolen rather than its body harmed. When townsfolk finally summoned the courage to burn the cradle, it refused to catch. Even pitch couldn't find grip on the wood. It had to be buried. And even then, the ground spat it back the next morning, upright and cleaner than before, waiting on the church steps where it had no business being. A travelling priest sent from a neighbouring parish came to investigate, and dismissed it all as superstition. He was gone within a week, claiming illness. Later, a telegram was received from Charleston. It bore one line, unsigned: "They do not offer gifts. They deliver warnings." After that, no bowls appeared again, but the Carroway windows kept glowing, and the wind began to carry the sound of someone rocking in a chair that no one could see. The wind changed direction in March, but not the way it does before a storm. It circled instead, low and close to the earth, curling up beneath skirts, slipping through keyholes, stirring candle wicks, not yet lit. The townsfolk spoke less. Even the boldest no longer crossed into the eastern woods, where the ridge began to rise. Yet the Carroway sisters were seen more frequently, always at a distance, always in motion. They passed through rows of barren crops, across porches long abandoned, along the creek beds that had dried into veins of white stone. Once they were seen kneeling around a stump near Widow Ames' barn, heads bowed not in prayer, but in perfect stillness, their hands placed flat on the frozen earth, as though listening for a heartbeat deep below. Then came the birth that broke whatever silence had been holding them back. Marian Doyle had not spoken since the death of her husband the year before. She had taken to sewing by candlelight and humming tunes her mother once whispered during hard winters, songs that held no language, only vowel sounds and breath. She was not known to be with child. No one had seen a swell beneath her apron. Yet one night, neighbors reported screams from her cabin, long, low, and layered with something else. Not agony, not labor, something closer to warning. At dawn her chimney stood cold, her door slightly ajar, and a pair of swaddling cloths, one damp, one dry, hung from the window latch like flags of surrender. Inside, Marion was seated upright on her bed, rocking gently, her eyes fixed on a wooden bowl at her feet. The bowl was empty, but stained at the rim with something darker than blood. Across her lap lay a child, wrapped in moss and pinned closed with black thorns. The baby breathed, but only once every few minutes. The doctor could not explain it. The preacher would not approach. When asked for the child's name, Marion whispered one syllable in a tone that cracked her lips. Again, later, a neighbor found a trail of twine and dried lavender buds, leading from Marion's cabin to the Carroway Ridge. It twisted in patterns, knots that mirrored cradles, teeth, bellies. A widow recognized the design as an old protection stitch used by midwives in darker centuries, meant not to preserve the child, but to ward against its memory. That night, a mirror shattered in the schoolhouse without sound. 3 birds were found beneath the window, their wings folded backwards, and Marion's cabin burned from within, though the exterior remained untouched. In the ash, only the bowl remained, now filled again with that black curdled milk, and beside it a single note burned into the floorboards with heatless flame. Do not name what should not have formed. Afterward, those who passed near the Carroway home claimed to hear humming in reverse, like breath being pulled back into a mouth that no longer lived. The ridge grew quiet, but not with peace, with pause. Something had come through, and it was waiting. By the first thaw of April, the earth beneath Dogwood Parish had begun to shift. Not dramatically, not with quakes or cracks, but subtly, as though something deep within had started breathing. Fence posts leaned without cause. Stones sank into soil that had once been dry and firm. Graves tilted forward. In the western field, a scarecrow turned overnight, its arms now angled downward, palms open to the ground, its head bowed. No one claimed to move it. When the children asked why it had changed, the elders answered only, "Because something else is watching now." That night, no lamps were lit. The Carroway Sisters had not been seen in over a week. Yet signs of their presence appeared each morning. A child's shoe, hand-stitched, unworn, found in the rafters of the town blacksmith's shed. A string of garlic braided with hair, nailed above a preacher's door. Porridge in an empty crib, still warm. Then, at the town square, a stone appeared, flat, grey, polished like a headstone. It bore no name, just a groove in the centre, wide enough for a newborn to lie in. The townsfolk did not touch it, but on the second day, a woman was found curled inside the groove. No memory of how she'd arrived, no shoes, and no mark on her, save for a single word carved shallow into her shoulder blade: mine. The doctor attempted to remove it, but the skin refused to part. He burned the scalpel after that. The woman was taken in by the apothecary's wife, who swore the girl didn't sleep, didn't blink, and wouldn't eat unless spoken to first in rhyme. Soon after, the chapel bell rang again, once, sharply, at the hour of deepest night, and beside it, the cradle returned. No one saw who placed it, but it stood at the chapel's threshold, swaddled in wool and salt, inside it a small waxen figure, with closed eyes and stitched lips. A thread extended from its mouth, like an umbilical cord, leading back toward the ridge. No one dared follow it. But the preacher's youngest daughter, Eleanora, began walking in her sleep that week, always in the same direction. Her parents tied her wrists to the bedposts, prayed louder, but still, every night she woke with mud under her nails and hair damp with dew. When asked what she dreamed of, she answered simply, "The sisters are sewing me." By month's end, Eleanora was gone, her bed undisturbed, her shoes dry. Only her baptism dress remained, folded neatly on the pew where she'd once sung psalms, buttons replaced with tiny polished teeth. The preacher collapsed that morning, whispering a scripture that didn't belong to any known testament. He said it was taught to him in a dream, by a hand that had no fingers, only soft twine wrapped in milkweed. The ground around the Carroway house bulged slightly now, as though something inside had begun to grow roots. And each night, as the wind curled low through the fields, it carried the sound of something cradled, not crying, not cooing, but remembering. The final summer before Dogwood Parish vanished from all living memory began with a birth no one could claim. At the edge of Gallows Fen, where cattails grow too tall, and the air tastes of iron, a fisherman found a child wrapped in linen, floating just above the waterline, dry, untouched, and humming softly to itself. No umbilical cord, no sign of struggle, just a note stitched into the cloth in fine red thread. Returned. He brought the child to the chapel out of habit, though no preacher remained. By then the bell tower had caved inward, the altar split, and the stained glass had melted down its leaded bones. He left the infant on the last unbroken pew, and walked out without looking back. That night, his fishing boat was found splintered along the riverbank, oars arranged in the shape of a woman's open arms. His body was never found. The child, however, remained. It was taken in by an old widow, who'd outlived all 4 of her sons, and stopped speaking after the last was swallowed in a threshing belt. She never asked where the girl had come from, never named her, only fed her broth, and placed an old rosary in her crib, not for protection but recognition. The girl never blinked, never cried, never aged. She sat each night facing the window that overlooked the ridge, mouth slightly open, as though waiting for something to be placed inside. One morning, the widow woke to find her own wedding veil spread across the floor, soaked in milk. The child was gone. In her place, a bundle of stitched linens filled with warm water, and a single vertebra, polished and carved with the letter M. That same week, a young boy, son of the cooper, began speaking in tongues during sleep. He said names that hadn't been uttered since the township's founding: Altha, Rosamond, Bethel, all stillborns, all buried behind the chapel before the war. His mother panicked, burned every cradle in the house, and buried the ashes. But the boy's speech continued, more fluid each night. He began drawing with his food, making perfect diagrams of birth canals, cross-sections of skulls, and midwife sigils from eastern provinces no one in Dogwood had ever visited. When the apothecary asked him where he learned it, the boy smiled and answered, "They left it in my marrow." He died 2 days later. No cause, just stopped breathing. His bones, when examined, had softened, folded slightly, like they were waiting to be rewoven. By midsummer, 3 more infants had been found, none born, all placed, each swaddled in white cloth, each bearing a mark at the base of the spine, a row of 6 tiny dots in a perfect arc, as if punctured by a curved needle. The 3rd infant opened its eyes only once. Witnesses said its pupils were vertical. It did not blink, it did not breathe, but the midwife who touched its chest felt a second heartbeat beneath her own. She never delivered again. The sewing began again in late July. Thread was found in places no thread belonged, woven into fence lines, braided through horse manes, curled inside ears of corn, not yet husked. It was pale, almost translucent, and sticky to the touch, as if drawn from something not yet cooled. The threads carried a smell no one could name, sweet, but not sugar, thick, but not rot. Those who tried to burn it said it curled instead, releasing a sound like breath caught in a throat. No one spoke of the Carroway Sisters anymore, not because they had vanished, but because the town had learned that saying their names was not summoning, it was offering. It was the cooper's youngest daughter, Ruthie, who found the cloth, folded neatly on the threshold of the abandoned schoolhouse. The bundle was stained in a deep umber hue, with 3 symbols stitched in thick, deliberate strokes across the front. No one knew the language, but every old woman who looked at it flinched. Ruthie brought it home, thinking it was a doll's quilt. She wrapped it around a bundle of hay and sang lullabies to it until dusk. At midnight, she woke her mother without sound, simply standing at the foot of the bed, with her hands wrapped around her own throat. Her palms were raw. Her lips bore needle pricks. and on her tongue, barely visible, was a single stitch, tight and bloodless. The cloth was burned, or so her father claimed. But Ruthie was never quite the same. She stopped speaking altogether, stopped blinking. She slept with her eyes open, never facing the window. When the doctor examined her, he found that her tongue had disappeared entirely, not cut, not injured, just gone, as if swallowed back into some unseen root. In its place, her throat hummed softly, like a lullaby buried under soil. That week, the birds returned, but they no longer sang. They perched on rooftops and chimney flues, in absolute silence, watching windows, watching cribs, watching mothers, with their hands folded tightly over their wombs. Then came the sound, low at first, almost imperceptible, like wood rocking against wood. But it grew louder each night, until the whole town seemed to creak. People thought it was the old trees shifting in the wind, until they noticed it only happened when the wind was still. One woman finally followed the sound, walking barefoot through the fog to its source. She stopped at the base of the Carroway Ridge, where 100 cradles stood in perfect lines across the grass, each empty, each swaying gently in place, though the night air did not stir. In the center stood the sisters, Hester at the front, eyes closed, Eunice beside her, one hand raised, and Meribeth behind them both, hands outstretched, holding thread between her fingers, not sewing, listening, as if the thread was whispering. The woman turned and fled, but by morning her hands had been stitched together at the wrists with the same translucent fiber, and across her chest, beneath her blouse, were 6 tiny dots, curved, deliberate. She never spoke again, only hummed. By August's end, what little remained of Dogwood Parish had ceased to resemble a town. The wells ran clear, but tasted faintly of ash. Crops stood upright, but bore no yield. Hollow gourds, boneless stalks, apples that collapsed under their own weight. The animals had grown silent. Chickens laid eggs, shaped more like teardrops than ovals, each filled not with yolk, but a thick, pulpy silk. A farmer who cracked one open found a perfect miniature jawbone inside, still soft and wet. He left town the next day, dragging his daughter behind him, in a wagon padded with salt blocks and church hymns, repeating a single phrase: "The births are not births, they're returns." A travelling parson named Othric arrived under cover of fog, carrying a dog-eared Bible and a tin crucifix warped by heat. He'd heard rumours in the outer counties, of stillborns that breathed again, of midwives with fingers too long to glove, of lullabies sung by children who hadn't been born yet. He entered Dogwood with a sermon on his lips, full of judgment and thunder, but no one greeted him, not because they didn't see him, but because they saw what followed behind. 3 shadows, moving without gait, never touching ground. The parson slept in the chapel that night, though it had no roof and smelled of milk turned. He awoke just before dawn to the sound of water, slow drops falling somewhere close. He followed it to the altar. There, seated in the pulpit, was a wax infant with hollow eyes and stitched feet. From its chest leaked a clear fluid that steamed when it hit the stone. Othric placed a hand to its brow, and wept, not for pity, but recognition. He left the chapel carrying nothing. He walked barefoot to the Carroway house, humming a tune older than the Psalms, and stood at the crooked gate, until one of the sisters opened the door. Who it was, no one could say. Their faces had begun to shift in memory, too similar, too blurred by time, and something else. He stepped inside. The door closed. No light showed through the windows that night, but the town's infant slept without sound. No cries, no breath, just silence, long and warm, and without end. In the morning the chapel pews were found stacked in 3s, each tied with umbilical thread. The altar had split again, this time revealing a hollow beneath, shaped like a womb, lined with soot and tiny claw marks. Othric's Bible was placed inside, pages sewn shut with golden thread. No one read it, no one touched it. Soon after the fog thickened, time folded, people began forgetting names, first their neighbours, then their children, then their own. But they all remembered the sisters, They remembered the cradle that waited even when no child came. They remembered the bowls, the thread, the silence between breaths, and in the moments before sleep, if sleep still came, they remembered the feel of someone brushing hair from their forehead, gently, and the sound of a lullaby with no words, sung by mouths that had never been born. By the first frost of 1847, no smoke rose from the chimneys of Dogwood Parish. No mail arrived, no bells rang. The town, once mapped in detail by clerks and circuit riders, now existed only in the dreams of those who had passed through, half-formed memories of sisters, walking barefoot across fields, where nothing had grown in years, of lullabies that stayed lodged in the back of the throat, like a swallowed needle. The Carroway house still stood, leaning heavier now, as though it bore the weight of something unseen in its upper rooms. The shutters never opened, the curtains never moved, yet some claimed to see silhouettes in the windows, tall figures swaying gently, as if cradling something too small to be seen from the road. The last record of any visitor to Dogwood came from a tax clerk sent from Waynesboro, a man named Elias Penn. He was young, unmarried, full of tobacco and God, sent by the county to account for abandoned properties and collect debts long buried in ledger margins. He arrived at the edge of the parish under pale skies, whistling a hymn without knowing why. In his satchel, he carried ink, paper, and a writ for the seizure of the Carroway property, its title never formally filed. He stayed the night at an empty cabin, ate beans from a tin, and took his boots off at the door like a man expecting to be made welcome. He was never seen again. Weeks later, a woman walking the ridge to gather kindling found his boots, placed side by side on the chapel steps, the leather tied with thread, the color of bleached milk. Inside each boot was a single vertebra, polished and still warm to the touch. The satchel was nailed to the chapel door. All pages had been removed, except one, pinned in place with a hairpin twisted into the shape of a cradle. It read only, "Property transferred, no child unclaimed." The church doors would not open after that. Families began boarding up windows from the inside, sealing attics, pouring salt across thresholds that hadn't been crossed in weeks, not to keep something out, but to keep something in. Infants were still being born, but always too early, or not at all. One woman labored for 16 hours, only to deliver a bundle of root and cloth, stitched together like a practice doll. She named it anyway, and when she died 3 nights later, eyes open, womb intact, the doll remained warm for 2 days after. No rot, no scent, just breath. It became clear that the Carroway sisters were no longer midwives. If they ever had been, they were keepers. Keepers of what had slipped through. Keepers of what refused to forget the body once carried. They no longer visited homes, no longer hummed beneath windows. Instead, their presence was marked by stillness. No wind, no birds, and the sudden unmistakable sensation that someone, somewhere, had just swaddled the world in silence, and was waiting for it to sleep. The frost thickened with unnatural patience, clinging to wood that no longer absorbed moisture, crawling up window panes from within. Those who remained in Dogwood Parish no longer marked time by sunrise or moon phase, but by the sound of settling floorboards creaking under invisible weight, chairs shifting on their own, bedsheets folding at the corners, as if shaped by unseen hands. The Carroway Ridge, once avoided, became something worse than feared. It became familiar, so familiar that even newcomers who passed through the valley, traders lost on roads no longer paved, found themselves pausing at its slope, drawn not by direction but recognition. One man, a butcher from Calhoun, swore he had seen that crooked house in dreams as a boy. He had never been to Dogwood. His father claimed they'd descended from stonemasons, not midwives. But still, the man stopped at the foot of the ridge, removed his hat, and wept without sound. When asked what he saw, he answered, "The room I was born in, the one no one remembers." His body was later found, lying across a patch of furrowed dirt, arms outstretched, jaw unhinged. A nearby tree bore the impression of a swaddled child, pressed into its bark, deep, clean, deliberate. It wept sap for 7 days. Children left in Dogwood began drawing circles again, not just on paper, but into the skin of their desks, their blankets, their own forearms. The circles always contained 3 points, one high, two low, forming a cradle shape inverted. The schoolhouse, long since emptied, bore them along the walls now, painted in flour and ash, spiraled tight like contractions. A boy of 9, whose mother claimed he hadn't spoken since the first frost, walked into the chapel ruins, and placed a bundle wrapped in linen upon the pulpit. It was not a doll, it was not breathing, but the linen pulsed slightly, as though remembering warmth. He spoke only one sentence that day. She said, "Not all births come from blood." That evening, threads were found again, twined through door hinges, woven into the manes of dead horses, laced through braids of corn hung to dry in attics, no longer entered. They stretched in impossible lines, disappearing into the tree line, into chimney flues, into the seams of dresses untouched for years. At dusk, the sky paled to bone, and every mirror in town cracked in silence. What the people of Dogwood feared most was not the sisters returning. It was the realization that they had never left, that what moved through the ridge, and through the veins of every house, had not been born of wickedness or miracle, but memory. A memory so old it had grown roots and names, and lullabies passed down in dreams, beneath floorboards, in the hush between a baby's breath and its first cry. And the Carroway sisters, still standing in that crooked house with lamps that never needed lighting, had simply waited long enough for the town to remember it belonged to them. The last snowfall came early, blanketing Dogwood Parish before the harvest could rot. It arrived soundlessly, heavy and wet, muting the town with such finality that even the most faithful among them stopped speaking aloud. No sermons, no blessings, no breath above a whisper. The snow did not melt. It clung to windows and roofs, to fences and trees, until the entire ridge looked swaddled, tucked in like a cradle, just before sleep. No footprints marked it. No animals moved through it. It lay untouched, as if the ground itself had been put to bed. And then, from beneath the snow, the humming returned. Not the soft lullabies of labor, nor the gentle rhythms once sung to ease a mother's pain. This was slower, deeper, a sound like wet cloth being pulled through wood. It came from every direction, from beneath floorboards, behind walls, inside basins long dry, and it carried with it a strange heat, not of fire, but of breath, the kind of warmth the body gives off when swaddled too long. Children began sleepwalking in pairs. They were found holding hands, standing at the center of town, eyes wide open, heads tilted, as if listening to a story only they could hear. They spoke no words, but when the doctor placed his ear to the chest of one of them, he recoiled. "It's not her heartbeat," he muttered, shaking. "It's not hers." In the chapel ruins, the final sign appeared. A cradle, not carved, not crafted, but grown. The wood curled inward, like ribs, smoothed by wind that had never touched it. Inside lay a bundle of linens marked with a single stitch, 3 loops, braided into a spiral, identical to the old midwife seal, once burned into the Carroway door. Those who saw it agreed on only one thing. It pulsed, slowly, like a heartbeat in deep water. No one touched it. No one prayed. A day later, the wind stopped entirely. The Carroway house disappeared that night, not with thunder, not with flame. One moment it stood crooked and watchful, the next it was gone. In its place, a depression in the earth shaped like a basin, wide, deep, lined with hair. The snow did not fall there, the air did not stir, only a faint scent lingered, sweet milk and pine, and something older, saltier, like blood washed too many times in the same cloth. By morning, the last remaining townsfolk gathered without speaking. They stood in silence at the edge of the depression, hands folded over their chests. Some wept, some smiled, none moved to leave, and one by one, they began to hum, not a song, not a psalm, but the sound of the womb remembered, the vibration of being held before the world asked you to breathe, before time named you, before stitching, before sound. When the snow finally melted, Dogwood was no longer marked on any map. No roads led to it. No letters arrived. But somewhere, When the night is quiet enough, mothers still wake suddenly, clutching their bellies, unsure why, and in the distance, something rocks. If you've made it this far, you already know, some places don't fade, they fray. Dogwood Parish was never erased, it was unwound, pulled back stitch by stitch, until it resembled something older than a town, older than scripture, older than soil, something passed from mother to daughter, in silence, in rhythm, in fear. The Carroway Sisters were never midwives, not truly. They were memory's hands. They held what the world refused to cradle. They whispered to the unborn. They returned what had been forgotten. And when the time came, they never asked for thanks. Only silence, only stillness, only to be remembered in lullabies that don't end. Some say they still walk. 3 figures seen at the edge of the fields, passing without shadow, barefoot, even through frost. Others claim that in the brief moments between sleep and waking, they've heard the soft click of thread through flesh, the slow creak of an empty cradle, the breathless hush of a room about to be entered. Maybe dogwood never existed, maybe it still does. So if you ever find a bowl at your door, filled with something thick and warm, or hear your child singing in a tongue you've never taught them, don't answer right away. Don't speak their names, just listen. And whatever you do, don't name what was never born.